Romans 13. God's legitimate authorities do good continually. Hello everybody, I'm Jim McCotter. Welcome. The government depicted by the Apostle Paul in Romans 13 continually will do good to the righteous and execute the wicked. Romans 13:4-6 says, "For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. For they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing." End quote. The government depicted by the Apostle Paul is not one that rarely or even occasionally fulfills its mandate. Rather, it fulfills the mandate during the entirety of its existence. The words, quote, "attending continually," in Greek is just one word, proskatero, which means to be earnest towards, to persevere, to be devoted, to be constantly diligent, end quote. That is, to do good to the righteous and execute the wicked. This is only possible with godly authorities and biblical government devoted to God's law. This eliminates any possibility that Paul is referring to secular government, much less godless Nero or any other godless powers not following God's law. Isaiah 10:1-2 says, "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people." End quote. The best one could hope for from a secular government based upon finite man's fickle edicts is that it may occasionally do good to the righteous and execute some wicked. But without God's law as the standard, it's impossible for man to sustain righteous government on any consistent basis. This is but one of many reasons why God's law order is imperative under the new covenant and why every Christian should be promoting it as government and society's standard. Man's endless, fickle laws. The following exposes the inherent volatile nature of man's ever-changing standard and why secular government can never be counted on to do what's right. W. Turner wrote, and I quote, "Two people could have walked down any U.S. street in 1930, one with a bottle of whiskey under his arm and one with a bar of gold in his pocket. And the one with the whiskey would have been criminal, whereas the one with the bar of gold would have been considered a good law-abiding citizen. If the same thing happened in any U.S. city in 1970, the one with the whiskey would be the law-abiding citizen, and the one with the gold bar would be the criminal." End quote. In a mere 40-year period, man's standard had completely reversed itself. Under biblical law, neither the bottle of whiskey nor the bar of gold is unlawful. The United States Supreme Court reversed itself in 219 cases in its first 212 years. As David Barton wrote, judicial, quote, "standards now change as rapidly as the justices. This causes an uncertainty for society and in fact often establishes a dubious standard which in effect is no standard at all." End quote. On average, Congress has enacted 4 to 6 million words of new law in each 2-year Congress. The same transposition of ethics has occurred innumerable times under all governments based upon the fickle laws of man. There's no enduring continuity in such capricious, ever-changing laws. Man's law provide a never-ending cycle of volatility. Moreover, whenever a biblical government ceases to perform in the fashion Paul details, it ceases to be the government that's depicted in Romans 13. It has ceased to uphold what made it a biblical government, that is, its devotion to God's law. It then becomes a secular government based upon man's capricious edicts, the polar opposite of the government described in Romans 13. Jesus said in Matthew 15:6-9, quote, "And so, by your man-made rules, you nullify the direct commands of God. You hypocrites, Well did Isaiah prophesy of you. These people say they honor me, but their hearts are far away. Their worship is worthless, for they teach their man-made laws instead of those from God." End quote. To claim Paul was promoting secular government in Romans 13 is to make him complicit in the type of government condemned by Christ. It would, in effect, make Paul a Pharisee all over again. No moral vacuums. There are no moral vacuums. Thus, there are no constitutions or procedural manuals void of their own inherent ethics. These procedural ethics are either moral or immoral, depending upon whether or not they are established upon God's moral law. Government either promotes God's morality as reflected in his moral law, or it promotes finite man's immorality as reflected in man's surrogate laws. Unless government is performing God's will and law, as clearly reflected in Romans 13, and it's doing it continually, quote unquote, it is not the government of Romans 13 to which Paul declares we're obligated to submit ourselves. Isaiah 1:10 and 8:20 says this, quote, "Listen to the Lord, you leaders of Sodom. Listen to the law of our God, people of Gomorrah. To the law and to the testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, it is because they have no light of dawn."